What we're going to talk about now are the relationships between the entities. So recall before that when we talked about entities, we said that some entities are strong entities. And by strong, we mean that they don't depend on any other entity. You can go immediately into the database and create this table and insert data into it without creating any other tables before it. So we say that it's a strong entity. It doesn't depend on anything, so it's independent. And then we talked about entities that are weak. And we said weak entities, they are weak because they depend on other entities. You can't create them until you've created other entities. So when we talked about the department, we said the department was a strong entity because you can just go ahead and create it and it doesn't depend on anything. But the employee entity was weak because before you can create an employee, you have to create the department that they work in. Now we're going to talk about the relationships between the tables. And we kind of touched upon one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many relationships before, but we're going to go ahead and talk about it formally right now. When we talk about relationships, relationships also have strengths. So there are relationships that are strong, and by strong we mean they are an identifying relationship. What this means is that you have a table that's a child table and a table that's a parent table, and the child table in it is storing the primary key of the parent table, but it's storing it as its own primary key. What does this mean? I know it's confusing, so let's take an example. So let's say we have a table that contains all the courses. So Java 1, Java 2, database design, network theory. And so we have a table that has all our courses, and every course has a primary key which is the course ID, which is like CSC 121, CSC 124, CSC 127. That's the course ID. Now, some courses are offered more than one time, so they are offered as sections. Now, in the table that has the sections, we said that we can store different, we can select different columns to be the primary key. So what we do at MCC is that we create a new key called the CRN, and so every section has its own unique CRN number, okay? That would not be a strong relationship. That would be a non-identifying relationship. Why? Because if you would look at the section, the CRN number, if I just gave you a CRN number, 30313, is there a way for you to see which section or which course the CRN is coming from? There isn't. And so we say that that's a weak, non-identifying relationship. Well, what would have been the case that made it a strong identifying relationship? If I tell you CSC 127 section 1, so now I have in the section table, I store a section ID like section 1, section 2, but in addition, I'm storing the course ID that this section is related to. So now the section table has a composite primary key. It has two columns that are the primary key. In that case, we would say that this relationship between the course table and the section table is a strong identifying relationship. Why is it strong? Why is it identifying? Because if you look at the primary key on the section table, you can immediately identify which course it is coming from because the course ID is stored there. Okay, so you can identify by looking at the child table, the section table is called the child table. You can find the parent that it's associated with. So we say that's a strong identifying relationship. Now, if we had chosen like a CRN number, that would be a non-identifying relationship because just looking at the CRN number, there is no way for you immediately to decide which course it came from. Okay. In our tables, the SQL tables that are in our database, the customer table and order table are related. You know, let's look at the customer table and the order table. So if I say select star from customer, the customer table just contains our customers, and each customer has a customer ID. Now, if I look at my order table, I think it was called customer order. here, what we're storing is an order ID. And so the order ID, if I go to the customer order table, let's just go to it to see that that's the primary key. So I look at my constraints and I find that the primary key is the order ID. So the order ID is my primary key. So my column that is the primary key is the order ID. So if I tell you order number 7, you can't immediately know which customer it came from or which product ID it came from. If we didn't have the order ID, if the order ID was not there and we just had customer ID and product ID, both of these were the primary key columns, like a composite, then that would have been a strong identifying relationship, because I would tell you customer ID 3, product ID 2, then you would know which customer and which product was ordered. But because it's a new primary key, it is not an identifying relationship. So this would be an example of a weak non-identifying relationship. Okay. Now, I just want to make sure that you understand this part. If you don't understand it, make sure you ask me so that I can explain it later during class or office hours, because it's an important concept. Now, there are 3 types of relationships. There's a one-to-one relationship, one-to-many, and many-to-many. And we're going to talk about each one. So a one-to-one relationship is a relationship that one entity has with another, but there's one entity to only one other entity. What are some examples in real life? One student has one banner ID, and one banner ID is assigned to only one student. So you as a student have only one banner ID. You can't have 2 or 3. At the same time, that banner ID that we give you is only assigned to one student. So this is a one-to-one relationship. A student has one banner ID, a banner ID assigned to only one student. A department has one manager, and one manager can manage only one department. That would be a one-to-one relationship. Now, if a department had co-managers, that would not be a one-to-one relationship, because then we can't say that one department has only one manager. One husband has only one wife, and one wife has only one husband. So these would be one-to-one relationships. When we draw the ER diagram, the one-to-one relationships, what we do is we put a line between the 2 entities, and we put this vertical line, which looks like a 1, and that represents a one-to-one relationship. How does that look in a table? For another example is one person has one passport and one passport only has one person. So here is another picture. Here we have those 2 lines instead of 1 line, and we're going to talk about what exactly these 1 line and 2 lines mean later, but just know that if you see a vertical line, that's a one-to-one relationship. So like I said, we can only see, we'll see it as one line on each side, or we'll see 2 lines on each side. When we're designing a one-to-one relationship, we are getting our external view, and we decide that the relationships between 2 entities, the department and the manager, is a one-to-one relationship. And then we move on to design it as a database. We move from the conceptual model, where we're collecting just the names of the entities and the relationships between them. And then we're going to go and start talking about tables and the attributes that are there. How do we do it? Well, a one-to-one relationship, because which entity has one of the other, you can actually just store it in the same table as one attribute. So when you have entities that have a one-to-one relationship, you really don't need 2 tables. You can just leave it as an attribute in one table. For example, if you have a student object, you can store the banner ID as an attribute, just a column, an extra column in the student table that stores the banner ID. If you have a student assigned only a single address, email address at a school, we can store that email address as an attribute. Now, we talked about characteristic attributes before, and we said that sometimes we may not want to store a one-to-one relationship in the same table, kind of like the passport example. We might want to separate them into 2 tables. And this is usually the case when we want to store more information than more than the entity really has. So here, like we said, if I have a person and the person, I'm storing their name and their social security number, and I want to store passport information. Instead of storing passport number, issue date, valid till, the visas that are on it, the country of the place of issue, all those pieces of information, instead of storing them in the person table, I can store them in a separate table and say, well, I'm going to store your passport information in one table, and maybe I'm going to store a list of the like your major and like your degree information in another table. So even though one person has only one passport, I want to store it in a separate table just to make sure my entities are clean. Now, this is a design choice that you will have to make, but for one-to-one relationships, what I want you to know is that a one-to-one relationship, the information can be stored in the same table as just additional attributes and columns. Or if you really want to, because there's a lot of information related to some aspect like the passport, you can store that in a separate table. And so if you do go ahead and store them in two separate tables, you need to make sure that those tables are connected somehow. So how are they going to be connected? Well, you're going to have a foreign key. So the passport table, for example, might store the primary key of the person that it refers to. So the passport would store the person, or you can have the person store the passport. So here, this picture is showing that the person is storing the ID of the passport that belongs to them.